today I'm going to cover a lot of ground. The show that's on at the American Folk Art Museum in New York is on till January 2nd, so you don't have a lot of time to get down to see it if you're going to try and do that. And the other show that I'm going to cover is Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories, which is at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and that's on through January 17th. So if any of you are getting up to Boston for the holidays or something like that, you might want to put that in your schedule. So what I want to do is kind of add something to the conversation here, because the curators, especially for the Weathervane exhibition, have done some really wonderful YouTube talks, and I have those listed at the end. You know, basically they've got, you know, the history stuff and how they're made and all kinds of really well done. And you know, it sounds like it might be boring, but actually, when you tune into these things, they're really kind of interesting. There's also a lecture with the curator and the guy who actually wrote the catalog for this American Weathervanes exhibit. But that being said, what I want to do is focus a little bit more on something which the curators kind of hint at, but don't actually go into depth or show images of. And that is the relationship, the connection between the folk art and American modernism and early modernism in the 20th century, and how actually the shapes and forms of these Weathervanes and other types of folk art were actually an integral part of the development of American modernism. So let's see. I'm gonna go to the next page, which is actually just shows you the images from the beginning of the Quilt Show up in Boston. I'm not going to have as much to say about the Quilt Show because the Quilt Show covers 300 years. So there's contemporary quilts in there, and it's kind of clear how that tradition has translated into contemporary art. But okay, all right. So the inspiration drawn from folk art by American modernists, the kind of abstracted shapes and simplified forms, the textural quality of the pieces, seem to fit the dominant aesthetic of the early 20th century. It's kind of it's this fanciful fantasy aspect, but also the textural quality of things. This, you know, many of the Weathervanes are quite big. I mean, as you can see from this photograph on the left, the scale of this thing is pretty big. So a lot of them are on the steeples of churches, on the tops of barns, on carriage houses and things like that. So that they need to be pretty large to be seen from the street level. You know, the photo really gives you a sense of that. Most of them are made out of sheet metal, and they're weighted so that they actually will spin with the wind and stuff like that. You know, there's a lot of technical stuff that goes along with it. On the right, you see in actuality, that's a watercolor of this Weathervane. And this is something called the Index of American Design. I'll talk more about this later when we get going a little bit further with this. Let's see. Okay. you can see in this really elegant form, this piece is, you know, really, it's quite remarkable. The texture, the weathering, the 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 use of thicker metal rods to define the wing of the bird, but also uses it for structural integrity, so that the thing holds up to the weather. So there's a real, you know, kind of crossover. And let me show you. This is a Milton Avery rooster chicken, and you can see kind of the idea of the simplified forms, the shape, the textural stuff that's going on in there. You know, there's a number of different things happening. Avery had a very large collection of decoys, and I know that he was familiar with these weather vanes. So let's move on. Here we go. Here's another Avery, and you can see the shape of the dove of peace that's down below from 1787, and the relationship to the birds painted by Avery. That actually, that the dove of peace that's down below was commissioned by George Washington, which is pretty interesting. Now, it wasn't the dove of peace at the time. It was just he asked for a bird, and that's what the fabricator came up with. And the middle of the lower middle screen is a cock from a rooster from Italy. This was from, I believe this is 17th century or 16th century. Just to give you a little bit of history, but I also saw the feathers and that tail and that this Avery up above on the upper right. I thought that there was a little correlation between those tail feathers. So in actuality, weather vanes date back to Greece. There are actually functional weather vanes that are still there from ancient Greece, which is pretty interesting. I mean, they of course have been fixed, have been reworked, because these things, you know, they take a beating out there in the weather. But okay, and so this was a very large industry. These weather vanes they really caught fire in the Victorian era. And there was kind of a competition between people to get the most ornate or most elegant or image that depicted what was being done or what went on at that particular farm or in that particular place. So this, you know, the exhibition is really, I mean, I haven't seen it in person, but I've seen a lot of these shots, and it looks like it's really a lot of fun. We're going to try and get there, but we'll see with COVID and all that. So basically, they were using these things for advertising, for prestige purposes. So there was a real competition, and there were catalogs of all these things. So again, these really simplified forms, really elegant shapes, and all of that was something that the modern artists at the time were looking at and taking in. So Ellie Needleman, who was a sculptor, lived from 1882 to 1946. This standing bull, you can see, directly the relationship between what he was doing with his sculpture and the kind of folk art design that went into the animals in general. Okay. Ellie Nettleman, with his wife, actually became major collectors of folk art. And in fact, Nettleman and his wife opened the first museum of folk art in this country, in Riverdale. In 1946, when he died, his wife donated the entire collection to the Historical Society of New York, and I believe most of the collection is still housed there. But you can see the relationship between these folk art pieces and what Nettleman was doing. And the other hero or shero that I discovered in my digging around is this woman named Edith Halpert, and she ran the downtown gallery. Now, I'd run across that name before, and I remembered it from when we did the Jacob Lawrence talk, and she was the gallerist that ran the downtown gallery. This was down in the Village. She opened it in 1925, and what she did was very unique. I mean, she valued folk art, and so what she did was she showed folk art alongside contemporary modernist paintings. So you can see on the wall. This was an exhibition that took place at the Jewish Museum in 2019 into 2020. So I missed it. It passed by without me being aware that it was there. But she is quite the person. I mean, she championed. She was the first person to give Black artists a show devoted to nothing but their work, and she championed Jacob Lawrence. She's actually the one who placed the Migration series. Half of it she placed with the Museum of Modern Art, and half with the Phillips collection. The odd ones went to the Phillips collection. The even ones went to the Museum of Modern Art so that they could join them together and do exhibitions in the future. She was quite the business person, and very successful in her time. And in fact, the folk art part of her collection, she had a major patron, which was Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, who bought all of her folk art collection through Edith Halpert. So what Edith used to do is go out driving in the country, and if she saw a great weather vane, she would stop and go up to the farmer's house and say, "Can I buy that?" And she'd make a deal. And so she had quite a fabulous collection of weather vanes. So let's see. Move on. And Noguchi also showed with her and tried his hand at Weathervanes. In 1933, he came up with these designs. I don't know how many of them were really ever put out into Mother Nature to see how they work, but he definitely was interested in the idea. Okay. And this is really an ancient piece. It's 17th century. Relative to Weathervanes, the longevity of Weathervanes is really kind of limited because they are getting beat up by Mother Nature all the time. So unless they are repaired or renovated, they tend to deteriorate over time. And not many of the wooden ones and there were many that were made of wood, not many of the wooden ones survived. Oh, by the way, if any of you have any questions, put them in the chat, and Joan will check them out. And if there's anything that relates directly to what I'm talking about, she'll send over the question. Okay. So the European examples, are there's only a couple of them that I put in here. I don't think those are in the show in New York. The main bulk of the pieces that are in New York are from American locations. Okay. And the patriotic theme was one that was often coming up with these pieces. Between the patriotic theme and the roosters or cocks, the interesting part about the cock stuff, about the roosters, is it comes out of the biblical business, the New Testament, where Christ said that he would be denied 3 times before the cock crows, and that's where the cock comes from. And a lot of those were on churches in Europe. So it's interesting. Now, looking at these pieces, this beautiful weathered eagle, you can see the detail that's in there, and what they will do with this is they kind of hammer in these details. They create a steel mold and actually take sheet metal and hammer it in to get those details. So the feathers, those striations and the feathers and all that are kind of hammered in with a hammer and a kind of blunted chisel tool with a kind of rounded end on it. And that's how they work a lot of these up. And then on the right, the Statue of Liberty, this was created around the time that the Statue of Liberty was put in place. In fact, the Statue of Liberty was being erected from 1875 to 1886 or something like that. So this would have been contemporaneous with the actual Statue of Liberty going up.
Larry?
Yes.
Going back, we do have a question.
Okay.
And he's asking, do any of the animals on the Weathervanes have significant meanings?
Yes, some of them do. And in fact, I don't know a lot about the mythological aspects of it, but a lot of them have to do with what type of farm or what type of location the Weathervane was going up in. So also what's going on here is, the carriage house was ubiquitous at the time. I mean, In the late 1800s, the conveyance that they had were carriages. So the horses were around quite a lot. So there were a lot of the horse image. So as far as knowing what the symbols are of the different animals and what those all mean, I'm shaky on that. Though there are a few that we're going to come to that are pretty interesting fantasy creatures. But we have this, which is a very, very elegant angel. Many of the Weathervanes are gold leafed. Okay, so they shine and sparkle in the sunlight. It's something that they did a lot of. They would take them down and regild them and all that. So they either had gold leaf or they were painted. Either way, they would have to be repainted over time. But the quality of the textures in this piece are really wonderful, and you can see how the artists at the time were really kind of affected by this. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about this index of American design. Basically, what you see on the upper left-hand corner is a watercolor and gouache on paper. This is the original, and it's pretty big. It's 71 inches across. So what happened was in the 30s, from 1935 until 1943, the WPA was creating what was called the Index of American Design, and they hired artists to do watercolors of the Weathervanes, of baskets, of quilts and rugs and things like that, pottery, all kinds of things. So there are over 18,000 of these watercolors in this Index of American Design at the National Gallery, which actually is accessible online. So I dove into that little treasure trove and looked around. On the lower right-hand side, you see the drawing and the process that was used to create the watercolor that's on the upper left. And they did this woman, Lucille, did this as an example for other artists to follow as the way to actually create the images for this book. Since many of these things weathered and wore, they wanted to preserve them. So that's what this effort was. WPA kept a lot of artists busy. Okay, there's this beauty. So this one is painted. So you can see that it's painted. I think this one is iron or steel, most likely iron, and you can see from the pitting and stuff like that and how dark it got. Copper turns green, so this is probably straight on iron. But beautiful shapes. I mean, these wonderful shapes. The shapes within the figure, but the actual form of these pieces is something that artists really prized. Here's a wooden one that managed to survive, and up above is the watercolor that went into the index. Okay, this is an interesting piece because this one is actually a mold. The wooden one that's on the bottom is the mold that they would create the steel actually the steel mold that they would work from. So what they did was they would cast it. They would put this. They would cast it in sand. All right, taking the wooden one and pressing it into wet sand, and then do a pour of steel into that mold, and then use that to put the copper over the top of that mold and hammer that in. So that's how you get the striations and all that. And this is the process that they use to do that. So they would be, they would do half and half and then weld the thing together. Or actually copper would be soldered. Okay, and here is again another one of Edith's artists. Kuniyoshi was a pretty well-known artist in his time. He was actually one of the best-selling artists in America at one point. And you can see here where he's got a weather vane on this sofa. It's part of his still life. One of the reasons why I said she's become my hero, because she actually, Kuniyoshi was, of course, Japanese descent, and during the war, he was on the kind of enemy alien status. And Edith, during the war, during the 40s, gave him a one-man show in her gallery and sold his work. I mean, that this woman was really, really courageous, and my hat's off. And I understand the show sold pretty well. So, okay. And as the turn of the century came along, horses kind of got left out of the scene because cars started to take over. Now, they were still doing these really detailed weather vanes, which are quite incredible. But how much of that can you see from 30 feet in the air? So it was more or less for the people who were buying the weather vane that they did all this detail in these pieces, because the functionality of the weather vane, it would function quite fine without all this detail. But like I said, there was a competition that went on in the Victorian era over who could get the most ornate weather vane, and the witch is really remarkable too.
I love that witch.
Yeah,
right in the crescent moon. It's fantastic. I love it.
Okay, so all right, and I didn't want to pass without a nod to Calder in all of this. Anything to do with wind, I think of Calder, and although I don't know how much he was looking at weather vanes, it definitely is a relationship, and I'm sure he was aware of them. And we're going to move on now to the quilt show at the MFA. Okay, and the link here is this Marguerite Zoric hooked rug. She was actually one of Edith's artists. She showed at the downtown gallery, and this hooked rug is not in the show, though there are a couple of pieces that are in this quilt show that are from her. This piece was placed with the Museum of Modern Art, and I'm sure that Edith was behind that. Yeah, I mean, these couple of shots on the left give you some idea of the layout of the quilt show up in Boston. The scale of these pieces is quite impressive, and the range of them. It's 300 years of quilts, so there's a lot of diversity in the quilts. I'm going to keep moving along because time is passing. Okay. Bisa Butler, this piece is really an interesting piece. This is from, she used a photograph by Du Bois from really basically the turn of the century, early in the 20th century. And the material that she used for this quilt is all kind of it's kente cloth and batik that was hand dyed in Nigeria. That it's a very interesting piece, and the dignity and the self-contained quality of these figures is something that drew her to this photograph. And at that time there was this is Morris Brown University, and so it was only in the late 1800s that it came into being. So this is a group of scholars and sportsmen that held a lot of hope for people at the time. So, all right. Oh, yes, Harriet Powers. So this was created by Harriet Powers, who was a Black woman who was born into slavery in, I believe, 1837 or something like that. I have the dates later on. And it is a really remarkable quilt. I mean, the combining of biblical stories in this story quilt is quite, it's beautiful, it's fun. There's Noah's Ark, and there's the crucifixion. There's all these different pieces of the stories from the Bible that are depicted. She was literate, so she really, there were a lot of letters where she talks about creating these quilts and how proud she was of her artistic achievement in what she was doing with these pieces. And here's some details. Okay, yeah, 1837. And there's a picture of her. And you can see some close-ups of some of these patches. Beautiful forms, really, whimsical. What are those animals? Okay. And for me, these kind of bold pieces, you know, that this piece was created. This chenille was created in 1930 to 1940. The quilt on the right was from the 1830s, and it's in Maine. This one's in Georgia, but there's a quality to the pieces that just spoke to me, and just the dialogue through the century is, I find, of interest. And looking at the details in a lot of this, the quilting is really beautiful. But there's these little vignettes, little stories throughout the quilt. Okay. And so one of the reasons why I'm not like going into a lot of contemporary artists, because I look at these Amish quilts, and they're really, you know, remind me of the color field painters, of minimalist painting. It doesn't take a real stretch to see these as painted color pieces. They really are, you know, the overlap in quilts into abstract painting is pretty clear. And Nancy Cresco, speaking of painters, she's a mixed media artist. She paints and does a number of different things. The figure ground stuff going on in this particular piece is really interesting. You know, if you try and follow those blue and green boundaries and see how they weave in and out from the background into the foreground, and it's a really interesting piece. Beautiful color. And just to remind you of a couple of weeks ago when we visited Solowit, you know, basically, I look at a lot of his work and see correlations to the patterns in quilting. Okay, and then there's this beauty. I can't quite figure out the logic behind the color changes in this one, but it's really wonderful. And how they arrived at that, I'm not quite sure, but it's really a beautiful, beautiful piece. I mean, that violet ground holds the thing together, but the changes that are happening throughout it are really surprising, and how the piece actually really holds together. But, you know, it's like, wow, why did you choose to put that there? Why did you do this? Why did you do that? There's a lot of questions that come up for me as an artist, trying to figure out some kind of logic, although it holds together and it's so buoyant and beautiful. Okay. And no quilt show for me would be complete without G's Ben coming into it. So this is a vote quilt. So if you look at the stripping, it's got the word vote in it. So she got this fabric from some kind of banner thing that was out there to get people out to vote. And the kind of patriotic element in a lot of the quilts. I didn't throw a lot of the American flag quilts in here, but they do come up with that theme quite a lot. And the one on the right is from around the Civil War. So again, that patriotic theme comes into play in these pieces. Okay. And the piece on the left is A Century of Progress. It's actually the theme of the Chicago World's Fair. And this is an image of the layout of the Chicago World's Fair. Interesting piece. And another G-Spend.
Larry,
yes.
When did we do G-Spend?
It was quite a while ago.
It was in the very beginning of the
yes.
series.
Yes.
So if you're interested in this, I think people should go back. All our videos are archived on our website.
Yes.
And so you could see these amazing quilts. When I remember it was such an interesting name for a group to begin with, but
yep.
all these
Bend, Alabama. I actually
Alabama.
No, it's Georgia.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't know.
Yeah. No, wait, it is Alabama. I'm going back. Basically, it's a small, isolated area, and they really developed this approach to quilting that is very unique.
I remember the photo you had of all the women sitting around.
Yep.
Quilting. So it really would be worth it to everybody to go back and to see that series.
Yeah, it's archived on our website.
Was it called G-Spend?
I believe it was.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And so this quilt is a housetop quilt, and you look at it and it's like, well, what is that about? Well, if you look at the houses that they lived in, a lot of them had these patterns in them and things like that. So that's where this housetop quilt pattern came from. Okay. And this is Sanford Biggers, who is a contemporary artist, and he does these installation pieces. People bring him old tattered quilts, and he'll sit with them for a long time, and then just trying to figure out what he's going to do with them, and then works with them. And a lot of his work has to do with the sense of grief, the sense of the grinding poverty and loss in the Black community, and he really kind of embodies that in many of his installation pieces. They're also combined with music and performance pieces that go along with them. Interesting. And the piece on the right is also Sanford Biggers. And I'm going to end with this fabulous crazy quilt. And this is from 1895. And, basically in looking through the thing, there's all kinds of, there's kind of religious themes that are happening in there. I see a Star of David, there's an angel, there's this, that, and the other thing. And I'm sure if you really got down and searched through all the symbols throughout the thing. I mean, I see the crescent moon with the star and, you know, the Islamic business. There's a lot of different things going on in this piece. So if you get up to Boston before the 17th of January and feel safe going to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, this show will be on. And a couple more Weathervanes. And there's all these talks, the virtual insights, Weathervanes in Context, that is with the curator of folk art at the Folk Art Museum and the scholar who wrote the catalog for the Weathervane show. And then there's also American Weathervanes, The Art of the Winds, which is just with the curator of folk art. Textile Talks is actually a talk on the fabric of the nation. And then this is how we do it, Edith Halpert. Edith Halpert had this show at the Jewish Museum, and the curator of that is the one who is speaking on that particular YouTube. So well worth spending a little time with them. Interesting stuff. In 2 weeks, no, 3 weeks, I guess it is, that we're gonna get together again because we got the holidays coming up. And I think, I can't remember for sure, but I think I'm gonna be taking you to the New York Historical Society because they have a new collection that they got of New York City images of paintings and drawings of New York. So I think that's where we're going to be going next. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to talk, but otherwise, that's it.
There's no questions. I just wanted to mention that we had 2 staff members of the library who are quilters. One was the former director, Pam Thornton,
right?
And one was the benefits manager, Joe Lanetta, and they used to bring in these amazing quilts and tell us about how much time it took.
Yes.
So I was always amazed. So thank you all for coming. And Larry, if you would just stay on for a minute.
Sure.
And have a happy, safe holiday. And hope to see you soon. Hope to see you after the new year. So have a happy and healthy new year too. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.